Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another Listen with Vobes. I'm Richard Vobes. Nice to be here with you again. Hope you can all hear me. Just suddenly remembered just before I went live to actually turn the camera on. I've been faffing about here. We are reading Listen with Vobes, and we're reading London Belongs to Me by Norman Collins. It's 4 o'clock here in the UK. Welcome to the live reading. If you're watching the rerun, welcome too. We have out there a number of people who have gathered around their crystal sets waiting for the valves to warm up, and amongst those we have TurboStream, Billabong O'Neill, the lovely Julia. We have Cooper 68, and we also have Philip Hammond and Mary. Mike Stevens is there, Audrey Forbes Hamilton, Lee Lawson, Jen Coley and Anne H, which is fantastic. Lovely to see you. Thank you very much for coming along. Right, we are... Where are we? I'll tell you where we are. We've started chapter 19, if I remember rightly. And can't remember where we'd gone with chapter 19. Mr. Josser had been collecting... That's right, Mr. Josser had been collecting rent. Fantastic. Diane Hooper may have tuned in too. Hello, Diane, if you're there. Hello to you, Diane, if you're there. Do say hello in the chat if you've got it. If you can't get to the chat, then don't worry, clearly. Right, I have with me my wonderful lemon and ginger drink to help me get through. And Linda Kane is there, listening while editing photos. Well done. And Julia M, I beg your pardon, Steve G, nice to see you too. And thank you for everybody else. John F has just joined us. Right, we will crack on. It's warming up somewhat. How far are we through? We are about a fifth. How long have we been doing this? 2 weeks. So we can work out roughly if that's a fifth, and that's been 2 weeks, it'll be a while yet. Percy had been on the pumps for nearly 2 hours. They were the old-fashioned sort, where you really did have to pump, not just press a button like the new ones. Hello to Michael White. When the two men... Oh, he was on the pumps when the two men came into the garage. He'd noticed them before they'd begun to mount the ramp up the pavement. He didn't like the look of them. There was something about them that was wrong. They looked like police officers, like detectives, like them. Percy took a glance, another glance, and his stomach sank still lower. They were both dressed in fawn raincoats and flannels, and they had very ordinary cloth caps pulled down low over their foreheads. Well, what of it? Half London, or at least half South London, dressed like that, didn't it? Nothing to worry about in that. But it was their size that gave them away. They were 6-footers, both of them, and they strolled rather than walked. It was as if they wanted to take as long as they could to get over to him. Percy knew this was the moment before they even spoke. The palms of his hands had gone messy, and he rubbed them off against the trousers of his boiler suit. "Can you spare a minute?" the front one asked, giving a little backward jerk of the head as he said it, as though he'd expected Percy to come over to him. "You want something?" he asked, without moving. He got his back to the door of the little glass box with the till inside, and he wasn't shifting unless he had to. After all, he didn't know they were the police. "Just want to make him few inquiries," the man went on. "If you get any customers, you can still serve them. We aren't in any hurry." That was it, all right. This was what the evening news had been talking about, but he wasn't going to show that he knew it. "What sort of inquiries?" he asked. "Want to buy a car?" The man shook his head. "Just routine inquiries," he said. We're checking up on things. Percy sucked his lips. Are you the patrol? He asked. No, police. Got your cards? The two men in the fawn raincoats produced their wallets. They carried their cards like season tickets. Percy examined them both, not actually taking hold of them because his hands were shaking. Okay, he said. You been here long? The first one asked. The other stood by, not saying anything. He might have been dumb, for all the use he was. Yeah, about 3 years, Percy told him. Know most of the people round here? Some of them. Ever go to the fun fair? Percy felt his heart give up. Percy felt his heart give an up and down beat as the man said it. It was as though one of the valves had seized up for a moment. Which one? He said. Funland, the man asked. You know, the nearest one. Oh, Funland. Percy was thinking fast, very fast. Yeah, I've been over to Funland. He paused. Not lately, he added. The man in the raincoat seemed interested. Stopped going there, he said. Know any people there? Oh, sorry, I've jumped a line. Stopped going there, he asked. Percy was cautious again. He wished he'd left out this last bit. Never went much, he said. Know any of the people there? Only by sight. Do you know her? Even though he was a 6-footer, the man in the fawn raincoat was nimble. He brought his hand round from the back, and Percy found he was looking at a picture of the blonde. It was an old photograph that he knew. It used to stand on the little table beside her bed. In the photograph she was wearing a bathing costume. The valve in Percy's heart seized up again. He shook his head. No savvy, he said. Then you can't help us, the man said, putting the picture away. Can't I? Percy answered. His mouth was so dry that it didn't sound like his own voice as he spoke. He had to keep running the tip of his tongue across his lips. Even after the men had put the photograph away again, he could still see it. The eyes kept looking up at him, and he remembered her as he'd last seen her. It brought it all back. But he was trying harder than ever now to show that he didn't care, that he didn't have anything to worry about. What did you want to know? He asked. Who killed her? The man in the fawn raincoat replied. He'd taken out a cigarette case and was offering it to Percy. But Percy shook his head. No thanks, he said. He was afraid of fingerprints if he touched the cigarette case. And he was getting confused too. He'd just been shown a picture of a murdered girl, and he hadn't even seemed surprised. That might look a bit fishy. Who was she? He asked. Cashier from Funland, the man answered. Name of Watson. And she's been murdered? Don't you read the papers? It was the second man who'd spoken now. He'd come sidling up and was almost on top of Percy when he said it. Percy was thinking again. Yeah, I did see it, he said at last. I remember now. It was all there, the second man went on. Picture as well. I wasn't specially interested, Percy told him. Perhaps she came after you'd stopped going, the first man suggested. Yeah, that's right, Percy answered. She came just after I stopped. How do you know she came if you stopped going? This was the second man again. He got a lower voice than the first man. It was soft, a quiet sort of voice. Well, must have done, Percy said quickly. Or I'd have known her. Perhaps you saw her and you don't remember, the first man put in. We don't expect everybody to remember everyone they've ever seen. Well, I may have seen her, Percy answered. I just can't remember. Did you write her any letters? The first man asked. Percy's heart bumped upwards. No, he was quite sure he'd never written to her. Thank God he hadn't. "I never wrote her nothing," he began. "How could he?" the second man said. "He didn't even know her, did he?" "So you didn't miss her when she'd gone?" Percy shook his head and didn't say anything. "You used to go over regular, didn't you?" the second man asked. "Well, pretty regular." "Why'd you give up?" "Too busy." "Been over there since she's gone?" "No." He blurted that out. Better to tell the truth whenever there was a chance of it. But the second man, he might have been the superior from the soft way he spoke, didn't attach any importance to his answer. "How's he to know if he's never seen her?" he asked. "He doesn't even know when it happened." The first man stood corrected. "Thanks, chum," he said. "Just ordinary routine, you understand." Percy squared his shoulders and tried to stroll slowly down the ramp beside them. "Let me know if I can do any more to help you." "Thanks," the first man answered. Percy ran his tongue across his lips again. They were so dry now they were cracking. "Hope you get him," he said. "Don't worry," the second man replied. "We will." Oh. Chapter 20. Dulcimer Street was at its most peaceful on these summer afternoons. The plane trees in the vicarage garden at the corner gave a pleasant flicker of green against the dirty stucco and the grey brickwork, and the everlasting pigeons were making big sweeping patterns in the sky. Some of the peacefulness of the scene, it must be admitted, lay in the absence of children. Dulcimer Street was just a cut above such things. It was left to side turnings like Dove Street and Water Street and Swan Walk to provide playgrounds for the next generation. Most of this generation was missing too. There was only one pedestrian coming down Dulcimer Street. He was a young man in flannelled trousers which were too short for him and a cheap sports coat. Every time he turned his head, and he kept turning it because he was looking for a number, the sports coat went into a deep ruck between the shoulder blades. The thing, in fact, was too tight for him. It was only by wearing it unbuttoned that he was able to get into it at all. When he got to number 10, he paused for a moment and inspected it. It wasn't noticeably different from number 8 or number 12 on either side of it, but the young man evidently wanted to know all about it. He might have been learning it by heart. When he had surveyed it from top to bottom for the second time, he went up the steps and rang the bell. It was the Josser's bell that he rang, and it was Mrs. Josser who opened the door to him. Mrs. Josser, she stood there in the protection of the hall, peering out into the bright sunlight with the cautious, suspicious expression that comes natural when nearly every ring of the bell means that it's someone who wants to sell you something. But the young man wasn't a seller. He hadn't got a non-electric vacuum or a fancy line in tin openers with him. On the contrary, he was a buyer. He had come after a room. Doris's room. This was why Mrs. Josser stared at him even harder. It was one thing inserting an advertisement in the local paper, and quite another meeting the person with whom you might actually have to share your bathroom. The most that she could concede at the moment was that he looked all right. And then a strange misgiving came to her mind. As she showed him the room, it struck her for the first time that it was rather a shabby little room, and she was ashamed of it. When Doris had been in there, it had been a family affair. The fact that the curtains had once been a bedspread didn't seem to matter. But now that it was a stranger who was seeing them, and somehow they looked more like an old bedspread than ever. But the young man wasn't particular. He was thoroughly easy and accommodating. He simply needed somewhere quiet to sleep. He was on the night shift at Battersea Power Station, and he wanted to be able to get a bit of a rest by the day. About 7:30 every evening, his room would be empty, he said, and they wouldn't see him until breakfast time. He didn't need very much in the way of service, provided that he could get his bed made for him. That was all he wanted. He understood perfectly well that he couldn't expect Mrs. Josser to provide him with a hot dinner at 8:30 in the morning, and he explained that he'd be doing most of his eating out anyway. All he wanted was to move in. His present landlady was going away, and he couldn't stay there any longer. He gave her name and the power station as references. The latter would have been enough by itself. It was like having London Bridge or Marble Arch as guarantor. And he was ready to pay the rent that Mrs. Josser was asking. He'd have paid in advance if she'd pressed him. 5 minutes after he arrived, he agreed to take the room, bedspread, curtains and all, and move in next Monday, assuming the power station didn't know anything to his discredit. Altogether, he seemed the ideal tenant. His name was Todds. After she showed him out, Mrs. Josser went back upstairs, her lips pursed tightly together. There was victory in that face, victory and the promise of further victory. She'd had Mr. Josser in bed for more than a week now, and for about 8 hours a day she'd been telling him that he'd have to give up all thought about going on with the rent collecting. The lodger was a brand new argument. Mr. Electrician Todd's weekly contribution would just about square things. Mr. Squales was sitting up in bed, reading a letter. He was wearing his long flowered silk dressing gown, the one with the stains of the previous breakfast all down the big flaring lapels. The letter was from a Mrs. Jan Bill, and it did Mr. Squales good to feel the expensive double-edged notepaper between his fingers. The sound of it, when he smoothed it out flat, was almost like an authentic crackle of a Bank of England fiver. Absent-mindedly, scarcely aware of what he was doing, Mr. Squales went on reproducing the sound. Crack, crack, it went. Not that Mrs. Jan Bill was not an engaging letter-writer. Mr. Squales had to admit that much. There was a burlesque, overbearing manner about her, as though she were taking up the references of a new chauffeur. But in the circumstances, he was prepared to overlook it. After all, she was very rich, and very rich women were often a little burlesque and overbearing in their manner. It was practically an occupational disease with them. The simple fact, and it was enough, was that she had written him a letter. Smoothing out the crisp paper, Mr. Squales reread what was there. Dear Mr. Squales, it ran, I could see you at 4 o'clock on Thursday afternoon at this address to discuss a séance which I am thinking of holding. My regular medium, Chakvar Ali, is disposed, and I urgently wish to get in touch with my deceased husband. Mr. Ali has been most successful at previous séances for which I've engaged him, and I have no wish to make any permanent alterations in my arrangements. However, I am perfectly prepared to give your talents an open test, and anything that you can do to enable me to correspond with Mr. Jan Bill will not be forgotten. I shall probably wish to hold the séance on next Saturday or Sunday evening at about 9 o'clock. If you are unable to attend here at 4... if you are not able to attend here at 4 o'clock next Thursday, please telephone to my secretary, and I will endeavour to suggest another time. In replying, please mention the fee for yourself and assistant, if any, which you have been accustomed to receive. Yours truly, Emma Jan Bill. Well, there it was. An engagement. Definitely an engagement. And there were two other things about the letter which were oddly flattering. In the first place, Mr. Chakvar Ali was right at the top of the tree among mediums. He was one of the few. There was therefore the pleasing implication that Mr. Squales was another of the few. It was as though a violinist in the second-rate Palm Court somewhere had received a letter saying, "As I can't say his name, Uedi Menuhin, however you pronounce his name, Yehudi Menuhin, is unable to be present at the Albert Hall on Sunday. Would you please come along instead?" And then there was the bit about suggesting the fee. Mr. Squales lit a cigarette and thought it over. It could, within reason, be almost anything. He could name 5 shillings, £5, or even 25. Mr. Ali probably received the latter, but then he was able to produce, apparently at will, a strong, unmistakable odour of lily of the valley, and feathers floated down from nowhere. That sort of thing always commanded a bonus. So in the end, Mr. Squales compromised on 5 guineas, and a guinea for the assistant. It sounded a respectable professional kind of fee, like a Harley Street, but he wasn't out of the wood yet. There remained the question of the assistant. Who on earth, he wondered. And the note paper. Mr. Squales remembered gloomily that he hadn't got a decent sheet in the place, nothing that had a printed or embossed heading to it. This meant that he couldn't reply in writing. And this was a pity, because Mr. Squales' handwriting had character to it. Give him a broad nib and a bottle of violet ink, he often told himself, and he could produce something that no penman need feel ashamed of. As it was, there was nothing for it but to telephone and let his voice do the trick. The one thing, he reminded himself, was to avoid the jangle of pennies at the beginning of the conversation. By pressing button A, while he could still hear the ringing tone, he would be able to conceal the fact that he, Professor Enrico Qualito, the co-equal of Mr. Chakvar Ali, was ringing up from a common call box. And now that he had settled the fee in his own mind, he surveyed the larger question. What precisely is it, he asked himself, that the old girl wants to hear? If he could find that out, the séance was halfway to being a success already. It might, for example, be her remarriage. For all he knew, she might be amorous as well as wealthy. But after reflection, he decided against such a possibility. Most women in the circumstances would want to forget their previous husband and not go trying to talk to him. Or was there something on her conscience, something that was haunting her? Yes, that might be it, but what? Even a hint, no matter how small, might be useful. He only wished that Mrs. Jan Bill was more the kind of woman who would take a man into her confidence. If only she would tell him what she wanted the late Jan Bill to say. Mr. Squales would make it his business to see that Mr. Jan Bill damn well said it. As it was, he was perfectly ready to admit that the whole thing might might turn out to be a perfectly dismal failure. Even a bunch of flowers suddenly plopping down on the table from nowhere might be out of place at the kind of séance that Mrs. Jan Bill was counting on. This was direct voice stuff or nothing. Connie had sunk her pride. She was back at Mr. Versetti again, and Mr. Versetti had sunk his pride too. He was no longer the proprietor of a flourishing nightclub. He was only the manager. There was a Mr. Scala, or somebody they called Mr. Scala, Mr. Versetti didn't mind. It kept him in touch with his old customers and made these things easier for the moment when the government was ready to forgive him and that he could open up once more on his own account. Mr. Scala's nightclub was called The Turban. Except for the fact that it was a basement instead of on the roof, it might have been designed by the same man who designed the Moonrakers. There was the same canary-coloured walls that were not much more than sparrow-coloured in places where the customers had rubbed against them. There was the same box-like lift that was so small that the occupants got to know each other by the end of their journeys. And there was the same footmarks on the doors, as though the patrons habitually opened them with their feet. But that was only a small difference. The real difference was that the lift went down instead of up. The leather and the chromium furniture, the glass and the chromium tables, the plywood and chromium bar were the same too. Even the toy tarantula stuck in the middle of the ceiling was the same. And so was the card room behind the curtained door. Mr. Versetti, in fact, had every reason to feel at home at the Turban. And so had Connie. The ladies' cloakroom was small, a brick cavern that branched out from the passage that led into the restaurant. It had once been the coal hole. There, seated behind a counter, plywood like the bar, were a saucerful of pins in front of her, and there, seated behind a counter, with a saucerful of pins in front of her, sat Connie. By screwing her head sideways, she could just see into the room beyond and catch a glimpse of the gay life being lived. But for the most part, her time was spent in giving rich girls sixpence change for a shilling, or running her hand lightly over the coats to see if anything interesting had been left in the pockets. It was her second night at the Turban, and it was getting late now, nearly 3 o'clock. The crowd, except for a small group in the card room industriously ruining themselves, had dwindled away to nothing, and half the waiters had put on raincoats and made off to their families in Balham or Mornington Crescent. Connie herself would be one of the last to leave. So long as there was even one lady, other than the professional hostesses, of course, left in the club, Connie would have to be there. After all, manners apart, she was responsible for the clothes that they had come in. Not that they were really so bad, these late hours. You got used to them. They were all friends together at the Turban. Only just now, the bartender who had been in with her at... only just now, the bartender who had been with her at Mr. Versetti's other club had slipped its... Sorry, I will just read that again. Eyes are jumping now. You got used to them. They were all friends together at the Turban. Only just now, the bartender who had been with her at Mr. Versetti's I can't remember how to pronounce that now. Versetti's other nightclub had slipped her a Manhattan that had been scarcely tasted, and she'd been making up on oddments all evening. A little earlier she'd eaten the better half of a chicken sandwich, only slightly covered with cigarette ash. What was more, she had got off her shoes underneath the counter, which meant that she could stretch her toes a bit. Connie, in fact, was doing fine. She got off finally about 3:30. It was a fine moonlit night, and the streets had that dignified, civilised appearance that comes from being empty of people. Regent Street, as she turned into it, was a white wall ravine, gracefully lit by hanging lamps all down the sides and centres. Piccadilly Circus had the quietness of a country fairground. The electric signs had all been switched off, and Eros, very Greek in inspiration but decidedly Edwardian in treatment, pointed his bronze bow blankly at the stars. It was even late for him. Despite a slight uncanniness about the place, Connie rather liked London this way. There was a pleasant feeling of importance about having the Haymarket all to yourself, as though you were a one-horse royal procession. And she turned into Cockspur Street with her high heels, setting up a kind of kettle drum accompaniment from the echoing walls of the tall steamship building. By the time she reached Trafalgar Square, the echoes just died away into space. The square was too big for one woman to have all to herself. It was like taking a midnight walk on the moon. It gave Connie the creeps. It wasn't far now, however. She only had to cut down Northumberland Avenue, and she was where she wanted to be, on the embankment. She could get an all-night tram from there. She dozed right off in the tram, and it was only the conductor calling "Oval" that aroused her. It had been a nice little nap. She even managed to fit in a short dream. She dreamt that she was an aeroplane, not in an aeroplane, but actually the aeroplane herself. She was in the midst of a giddy series of loops and side rolls under her own power when the conductor roused her. She was just the teeniest, weeniest bit tiddly. But she got off the tram all right, and here, out at Kennington, it was even quieter than the middle of the town. When the tram had gone swinging off into the night, when the tram had gone swinging off into the night, it seemed that she was the last living thing left in London. No, not quite the last living thing. There were the cats, lots of them. Up in the West End there was always one or two peeping inside the lids of dustbins, but here there was a whole sub-jungle life going on among the bits of privet. There was prowling, love-making, and assault to be discovered in those sleeping front gardens. But when Connie got to Dulcimer Street, there was a surprise waiting for her. She had just turned up the gate of number 10 and was preparing to mount the steep flight of steps when she saw the door was open and there was someone standing on the top step. The porch cast a dense black shadow, and she couldn't see who it was. But what she had seen was enough. In all the years that she'd been coming back to Dulcimer Street in the small hours, she had never known anyone else at number 10 still about. It smelt fishy, distinctly fishy. So, hitching up her dress, she darted up the stairs like a ferret, and when she got to the top, she found that it was Percy. Breathless as she was, it was Connie who was the first to speak. "What you doing this time of night?" she asked. Percy paused. He was careful now to pause before answering any question about himself. It was only this afternoon that 2 policemen had called on him in the garage. "Just slipped out for a breather," he said. "Couldn't sleep. Got heartburn." Connie walked up the steps beside him. "Next time you've got anything on your conscience, just come up and tell Auntie Connie," she said cheerfully. "She'll put things right for you." As a matter of fact, Percy was nearer telling her than she realised. He'd been standing out there for nearly half an hour, looking down the empty street, trying to sort things out. "If only I'd got someone to talk to, I'd be okay," he'd been thinking. "If I could get it off my chest, I could get back to bed again. I'd go back to sleep. I'd feel fine in the morning. If only I'd got someone to talk to, I'd be okay." The proudest man in London at the moment wasn't a Londoner at all. He wasn't even an Englishman. And, for that matter, he wasn't in England. He was Dr. Otto Haffel, and he was standing on the German soil, the sacred German soil of the embassy. It was the first time that he'd ever been inside. On other occasions, he'd simply stood at the top of the Duke of York steps, looking at the large yellow building that was so like all the other buildings in Carlton House Terrace. So like, but so utterly unlike. More than once, the sight of the black and white flag with the Nazi swastika on it had brought tears to his eyes as he saw it there, prophetically fluttering in the very windows of the King Emperor's palace. There had been tears in his eyes again tonight. But that had been different. That had been when he had shaken hands with the ambassador, had shaken the hand that had shaken the hand of the Führer. But he had pulled himself together hurriedly. It would have been un-German to weep publicly. It would have been Latin. Worse, it would have been positively Jewish. And after all, he had made his bow and stepped back so that he could look at the rest of the assembly. After he'd made his bow and stepped back so he could look at the rest of the assembly, he saw how unthinkable emotion would have been in such company. Such a company. With the exception of little Dr. Haffel himself, they were all magnificent men who were gathered there. Magnificent men and blonde, motherly women. Only the ambassador himself looked a little worn. He had pouches under his eyes like an abdicated English king emperor. But the military attaché was superb. He was a Siegfried in the shining armour of a boiled shirt and tails. As he regarded him, Dr. Haffel tried to comfort himself by reflecting that Dr. Gerboils was of small stature also. His heart was larger than his body, people said, or the Führer himself, for that matter. But this was a silly thought. It was irrelevant. It was blasphemous. The Führer was beyond all size. He was not a man at all. He was a vibration, a radiation. One of the footmen was standing beside him. Dr. Otto Hatfel, Secretary of the Overseas German Students' Federation, London branch, was being offered champagne. He sprang to attention, and carefully, so as not to disturb anything, he selected one of the tall, gilt-rimmed glasses. But having taken it, he made no attempt to sip it. He had drunk 2 glasses already, and he was cautious. Only a moment ago he'd caught himself staring at his own reflection in the mirror, as if he had been a stranger. It was now 3/4 of an hour since anyone had spoken to him. All that time he had simply been alone in his corner, watching. Not that he had felt miserable or neglected. On the contrary, Dr. Hatfel Ph.D. Heidelberg, was blissfully, rapturously content. Happiness, he was telling himself, is not necessarily perfect only in retrospect, as the book says. It is perfect also, provided the subject experiences it in mental solitude. If I were distracted by speaking to someone, I should not realize just how happy I am. But the 2 earlier glasses of champagne had loosened something inside him. It now seemed selfish to remain silent. Dr. Hatfull looked round for someone to speak to. Beside him, there was a very large man, and a visiting industrialist, perhaps, also alone. Dr. Hatfull addressed him. "It is very agreeable, is it not?" he asked, "to hear nothing but the German tongue spoken?" The large man raised his hand. "Quiet, please," he said. "Excellency is about to say something." Dr. Hatfull blushed and spilt a little of his champagne in his agitation. Then he raised his eyes. At the far end of the immense room, more immense than it seemed because of the severe German style of decoration which had covered up the English decadences of architecture, Riventop was standing. Above him, the crossed Nazi flags, which, with the Führer's portrait in the middle, were the only decorations in the room. He was speaking to the German correspondents in London. "Less than a year ago, the Agreement of Munich was signed," he was saying, "and the peaceful restraint of German foreign policy was again demonstrated. Less than 3 months ago, our Führer assumed the protectorate of Slovakia, and a storm centre of Europe chaos was reduced to order. Melaland is now German territory. Has there been war? Has one drop of blood been spilt?" The ambassador paused and coughed into a handkerchief. "But it would be idle to ignore that we have enemies, powerful enemies. Certain politicians are anxious to surround the Reich in an intense meshwork of barbed wire barricade, I will call it, of pacts and guarantees. Take the French and the British guarantees to Poland, Romania, and Greece, and the signing of the Anglo-Turkish Pact. Such indications cannot be ignored. That is why the world powers of Germany and Italy, bound in inalienable ties of affection and respect, and have concluded last week in Berlin a solemn military alliance, and to extend protection to the smallest states imperiled by the frank imperialism of one of our neighbours not entirely unconnected with the New Jerusalem." Ribbentrop smiled suddenly, and all the reporters smiled too. "This week, Denmark and the Reich have signed a pact of non-aggression. Again, I remind you, in this off-the-record chat, would a nation which wishes to wage war sign a pact? The pact has already been circulated to the news agencies, and our press attaché has advised you how to handle the London reaction." If only Dr. Hatfull was thinking, my schoolmaster, my professor systematic philosophy, my mother, my 2 sisters could see me now in the German embassy representing the Students' Federation, listening to our ambassador. The list of those present, I am by so much more than any who are absent. What? I am by so much more than any who are absent. It was nearly 1 o'clock when Dr. Hatfull came away from Carlton House Terrace. It was a pale June night, and London looked very beautiful. Beautiful and defenceless. It is 1:45. I don't think we're going to get to the end of this chapter, and I think we should leave it there. And I don't mean to shortchange you, but we are on chapter 21, and sometimes we don't want to lose the flow. And I don't want to lose the flow. There's a few pages there, and I don't think we'll get through it. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to say, have a good weekend. You can't leave them there, Mr. Derek. There is something dodgy going on with that Dr. Haffel. Percy is being hounded by the police and is worried out of his mind. Connie has got a new job. Mr. Josser is in bed with having a cold, and Mrs. Josser has taken on a lodger. Meanwhile, Doris is still living with Doreen, and Doreen is a bit upset that Doris went out with Bill. Mr. Squales has an appointment, and he is trying to work out the best way to honour the appointment for Mrs. Jan Bill. And Mrs. Vizard. What of Mrs. Vizard? So, next week, no doubt some of those things will be examined, explored, and more will be unveiled to us. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. I enjoyed it. It's all good fun. So, yeah, we're coming up to about 1/4 of the way through now. Just under, I reckon. So it's a brilliant book. Thank you very much. We will catch up again next week. Have a good weekend. I will see you on the Vobes show. And take care, and thanks very much for all your support. I very much appreciate it. We do have another book to read after that, which is rather good. So I hope that's it, really. I hope you're all having a nice time. Sorry to be a bit short, but I just thought it was probably the best. Anyway, that's enough waffling from me. Take care, look after yourselves, and I will see you next week. Bye-bye for now. Bye-bye.